Hello, welcome to the third episode of Scary Thoughts, Horror, Philosophy, Culture. I'm Mark Cate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
And in this episode, we are going to be talking about the movie It Follows. Just to prepare you, next episode, for episode 4 of Scary Thoughts, we will be discussing The Neon Demon, which I loved. Not a lot of people did, but I totally think you should see it, especially so you can listen to us talk to you about it.
And it's new to me, too. I haven't seen it yet, so we'll all be watching it fresh, except for Mark, who has a little bit of experience. As always, this show is full of spoilers. It's the spoiliest show ever. We don't really do reviews so much as just talk really at length about the show, so hopefully you've seen it. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. It's how we rise in the ranks of other podcasts, and we're looking to be the greatest philosophy horror podcast of all time.
Which we already are.
I think we're the
We
only
just
one,
need to be
right?
recognized.
Yeah.
as such.
Yeah, so it takes about a minute. And if you go to our Facebook page, there's instructions on how to do it on iTunes. Several people have emailed me and said, hey, I don't even know how to do it. So thanks a lot, Apple.
So
the basic plot element here is that this character, Jay, has slept with a guy who reveals to her that he has passed on this thing through sex. Something is following him, and now it's following her, and it's going to kill her. And if it kills her, it's going to kill him. So that's basically the thing that everybody's running from. That's the monster in the show. And the easier interpretation is that it's all about sex. But I think that's a pretty surface.
I agree.
The surface reading of this, and and then because of this movie, I think is based on the director's dream, and it has so many dreamlike elements. I wonder how effective interpretation in general even is to this film. Like, how important does it even work for this film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most obvious, straightforward interpretation is some sort of moralizing about premarital sex, and there just really isn't any indication in this film that it operates at that level. There's really sort of zero morality in this film, which is partly perhaps referring to the generation of the characters that we're following around. We can probably get back to that later.
I mean, there's definitely no, usually what comes in hand with sexual morality tales is some sort of slut shaming, right? At no point does any of her friends go, man, you shouldn't have slept with that guy.
No. Or
that guy was a bad dude, or you shouldn't sleep around. There's just this question of whether or not she's going to pass it on to somebody else. And it's so emotionless a little bit that essentially, you have two choices of how to pass it on. One is you could pass it on and not tell them, which means that they're going to die, and you've just bought yourself a little bit of time. Or you could pass it on and sort of initiate the person into this this really micro society of people who are being followed. And that choice of bringing somebody into it or out, or just letting them die, and then no one really has anything interesting to say about that in the film. Her friends are very blasé about the fact that there's a monster creeping after her. And the two people who have display fear in the movie are the girl from the opening scene. She's completely terrified.
Yeah.
And seems to have not reached out to any sort of circle of friends. She runs away alone. She dies alone. You're introduced to her in that really amazing opening sequence where it's just a single shot, no camera edits. She runs out of the house, freaks out, talks to the neighbor, gets in her car, and drives off. It's really a fun opening scene because you're like, man, what's happening? And then her death, you don't see it, but the result is so graphic, and that graphicness never really comes back into the film. Which is interesting. I thought for sure it was going to be a super gory movie, just basically because of the body you see in the beginning, and that doesn't happen. But all of this stuff does not point to the typical horror movie sexual morality tale, which is sex, gruesome death.
Right. Well, there are two, unless I'm forgetting part of this film, there are two moments in the movie that are separated from our protagonists. There's her, and she's becoming totally unwound, terrified, amplified to a level that doesn't exist in the rest of the film. We see them running, we see some screaming, we see her crying, but it's all pretty low-level simmering. There's not a freak out. I think her character's name is Annie, the woman who dies at the beach. Like her in the rest of the movie. And also there's that scene just before we see what's his name having sex with Jay in the hospital, there's this sort of dolly shot across all these windows, and we're peering into the hospital of all these other lives. And there's like a family, and they're all warm, and they're together, which doesn't exist in the rest of this film. Yeah. There's people laughing, sort of going about their lives in a way that is so different from our protagonists. And so even though It Follows creates this world that is incredibly self-contained, and it's this world where everybody is so dry and devoid of emotion and all that, there are actually these two moments where it's like, oh, maybe it's just them. There is an outside of this world in this world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the teenage universe of the film, like all that stuff is always out of focus. Like there's a scene where two adults are talking, but neither adult is in full frame. They're out of focus. They're drinking. So you know, usually when characters are drinking or doing drugs in a movie, it's sort of like a nod to that they're not a reliable narrator, which is interesting when you think about that. You know, the millennial characters of the film are living in past culture. They're living in like this kind of like 90s. Like I guess you could read it as nostalgic, but it's also sort of this worn down, worn out world that's kind of reached the end of its usefulness in a lot of ways. And, you know, the adults that are there have no answers. You know, they're not even connected to the threat. They're not even told about the threat. You would think that you would tell somebody who was an adult or somebody that what was happening and to find some sort of solution to it. But the kids, the characters, they really don't look for any real solutions. And their solution of like trying to kill the monster by like electrocuting it in a swimming pool is absurd. I mean, how's that even going to work? You know, so you're like, are they just unprepared for this sort of threat? You know, maybe that's a interpretation of the film. Like, what does it mean to be completely unprepared for a threat?
Yeah, I think that this is a really smart film and has a lot of really compelling elements and a lot to uncover. When I first saw It Follows, I have to confess, like, I just saw it as... I thought it was really scary. A lot scarier than anything I'd seen in a long time, much to its credit. But after seeing it, I was like, well, that was just a really good, scary movie. Right. And then I saw it again, because I thought it was really fun. And picked up on all these extra layers of, you know, when it... For just random example, it takes the form of other characters in the movie or her dad or, you know, like I did not pick up on any of that on the first watch because I was so consumed by it being scary and the soundtrack and the momentum of the film. But the more I watched this film and picking up on these little cues and clues throughout on what is actually happening, this film doesn't resolve. There are more questions than answers. But upon rewatching it, there are little cues about certain elements of the film. But at the same time, there's also a lot of kind of sloppiness and messiness that becomes more apparent on rewatching. Like the family photos on the wall, I think are just terrible. It's just not funny, or it's a distraction that they're all like smeary and weird and kind of like janky 2010s horror movie, spooky. The e-reader, I don't know how much time we want to give to that nonsense, but I think that for me was like the worst part.
The clamshell e-reader.
You know, maybe it looking like a birth control pill case, maybe there was some sort of idea and reference there, but if there is, it's flat. Yeah. And it was just too outside of I liked that it was temporally very smeared, this film, but I thought that as a sort of break from its own logic was not a smart one. It was just too lampshaded. Yeah,
well, one of the real popular criticisms that people pass around about this movie is the one that Quentin Tarantino made. So he made, in some interview, people were asking him about movies that he saw recently and what he thought. And one of the ones that came up was It Follows. And he had a lot of good things to say about the cinematography, the soundtrack, and all that stuff. His big gripe with the movie was that the monster doesn't follow its mythology. Like it doesn't follow the rules that the character sets forth, where he's like, it will walk forward towards you. That's all it does, but it's consistent and it won't stop. It can appear as people that you know, whatever it takes to get close to you. But that it's not what happens at all. You know, like there's only one incident where it appears as a character that the person knows, but it's always off. Like it's when the monster breaks in to kill her neighbor friend that sleeps with her. It's his mom, but her robe is open, so it's weird. There's always like this uncanny weirdness. Like it doesn't seem, you know, and you're not going to stop for your dead father or your missing father that's throwing things at you. Like it never uses the mechanism of appearing like people you know for
in its favor.
In its favor. It's always seems to disturb. Like it's always to make it weirder. So Tarantino, he thinks that the movie would have been better if it followed its own rules. And that's one of his things. Like he has, I guess, books and books of things written, backstory that always inform what's happening. For instance, the Hattori Hanzo swords in Kill Bill, one of the rules is if they're taken out of their scabbard, they have to draw blood before they go back into their scabbard or something happens. I think like maybe the sword breaks or something like that. So if you'll notice in the film, anytime one of the swords comes out, pretty much somebody like gets cut or dies or blood has to go on the blade, right? So that's always informing his writing. But I don't think he's right because the director of this film is pretty explicit that it's based on a dream. So a lot of the sloppiness you could probably just say is just slipperiness. So is he trying to mimic what happens in a dream? Like is the clamshell just a weird memory of what a phone looks like? Because one blogger I read somewhere said that you know, where have we ever seen a clamshell phone e-reader before?
Slash dual flashlight.
And the only time is in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, April O'Neil, her phone is like that. It's a clamshell. Like, so could it have been just... And when you're watching the movie, what's on the screen a lot of times on the televisions are cartoons. Mm-hmm. So is this simply like something that has been picked out of a cartoon and imported into a dream and it's weird because of that? Or is it just stupid? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to something we talked about in episode 1 about Stranger Things, where when you create a logic for a film or a TV show, and I think there's a line between it being slippery and it being broken. And I think that when we say something is maybe based on dreams, and that is our excuse for its sloppiness or clunkiness, I have a hard time jumping on that train.
Yeah.
Not that things need to follow a logic for me, but that if we're suddenly resorting to saying like, well, it's kind of like a dream, so therefore anything goes. Like, I think that there's something interesting about thinking about film in particular as having an evolution and moving forward and improving upon itself. Like, let's say a movie came out this year where the characters all talk like this, see? And it was very, old Hollywood. And it felt very formulated and self-conscious. Well, we would think of that as an homage and being self-aware and smart, maybe. But we wouldn't just sort of watch it and go like, oh, this is the way movies are. Movies aren't like that anymore because that lack of naturalness has sort of been exfoliated from the way that we make movies, because I think in a way we've evolved from that kind of...
We're not making stage productions anymore. Like there's no projection, there's no...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's an improvement. Not that naturalness is an improvement, but certain kinds of affect that we leave behind, I think is for the better. And I think that when... like the sort of dream logic where we can excuse weird filmmaking choices because of, well, it's a dream. I feel like, for example, we don't accept Nightmare on Elm Street logic anymore from our horror films. They don't need to be super rational, but like if we could imagine an 80s style horror film with supernatural elements that is as sloppy and messy and nonsensical as the Nightmare on Elm Street films coming out now, I don't think people would hang with that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't hang with that. It would just feel like it was nostalgic and an homage to that film, but it couldn't stand on its own because we've evolved past that. I'm
glad you mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street because the whole movie that it follows feels like the moment in Nightmare on Elm Street when a character has fallen asleep and it's before things go off the rails, before Freddy's reintroduced himself. So there'll be one or two clues that the character is dreaming. Like the like the scene is sort of hazy. Like there's like a slight smokiness. And you definitely saw this more so as the film franchise went on, especially Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors, like when people kind of had more control of, like where they have the idea is that they have some sort of lucid dreaming that they're allowed to do.
Suddenly there's agency in the world that Freddy's created around them. Yeah.
And so It Follows reminds me a little bit of like the moment when the characters have the agency, but just like in the third Nightmare on Elm Street, it's ultimately futile because the thing comes and kills them anyway, which is sort of life. You think you have agency and then you die. So there's that. The other thing that's interesting about their universe to me is how bound it is. Like when they try to run away, they go to the coast. That's it. That's their border. The first girl that dies, she runs away to the coast, and that's where she dies. So they never are able to get out of their city. Like they're never able to leave it. They're never able to move on. They don't even have any ability to. Like you would think that a character would just keep driving, which is one of the things that I had happen over and over again in conversation with this film in the time between when I watched it and now recording. Everybody wanted to talk about what they would have done.
Yes.
Like that's one of the things that I found really interesting about this film is like everybody's like, oh, well, I would have done this. I would have slept with a Navy SEAL and he would have gone to Afghanistan and slept with a hooker there.
That's an evolved version of don't go back in the house.
Right. Yeah.
Having a better plan. I think there's a lot to talk about location and vehicles.
Yeah.
But while we're still talking about, let's say, rules and talking about rules of engagement, like how last episode I was talking about the differences between the idea of rural horror and folk horror, I think that this film, like The Witch, exists in a sort of liminal space between two types of horror films, and that is Japanese horror and American horror. It Follows really is a Japanese horror film with American horror values. So Japanese horror films often centers around some sort of supernatural evil that has some sort of weird, vague rules, like you watch this videotape, the phone rings, you have a week to live, right? That's these vague, nonsensical rules that happen in a lot of Japanese horror films. And these rules are often vague premises based on superstition. They're illogical. They break down before the film is over. So Japanese horror films often involve a never-explained curse. And rightfully so, right? Like, supernatural is anti-nature by nature and should be impossible to understand and should be unrestrained by rules. American and European horror films tend to be a lot more rational, like vampires suck your blood and can't go out in the daylight. Zombies can only be killed by a head wound. Or non-supernatural, the killer's unrelenting but not supernatural at all. Right? It totally in our rational world. In It Follows, the mode of the Japanese horror film that is based on this barely explained curse is in the mode of the American horror film. It doesn't really defy the rules that it sets up. Japanese horror films, there are rules and they totally defy them. But American horror films, they usually follow the rules pretty aggressively. In fact, the rules in It Follows are explained like right up front. Like Hugh just lays them right out for Jay. And then we grapple with how this movie is following them or not following them. I think part of It Follows, what we were talking about earlier about maybe it being sloppy or clunky, is I don't think it needs to follow the rules that Hugh sets up. I think that in itself is a dumb rule. Just because someone on screen says something doesn't mean that now we have to follow that template for the rest of the film, or the filmmaker has to follow that template. But I do think that the world building is slightly inconsistent. Not to be explained by dream logic.
Yeah,
though.
I'm almost prepared to give the dream logic route a pass.
Okay.
I'm almost prepared to, because the movie is so formal in every other way. Like the way it's shot, the way, the casting is great, the music is great. I just can't imagine this director being sloppy with that. I just can't.
That's something I do, for example, like the temporal slippage in the film, I really appreciate. I guess for me that when we give a pass to a film because of dream logic or something like that, where can that end? Where, like, let's take it to the logical conclusion. Does a Martian show up and whisk everybody away to Pluto? At what point is it?
Well, that's the American Horror Story model. They just give zero fucks. Like, whatever they think is going to be interesting on the screen comes on the screen.
But that zero logic has a logic. It does. American Horror Story's logic is it gives zero fucks. And so it won't suddenly become a Western, though. Right? There's some
are you
line.
Sure? I mean, because all of a sudden...
I don't mean Western-like. I just mean, like, John Wayne isn't going to walk into the screen.
That movie breaks out into Jazz Hands chorus line. Like, I mean, it becomes a musical, like, part of the way through it, which I think is... Okay. I don't know. So... Here's another thing to consider. Like, all these new directors are just heavily nut-riding Stanley Kubrick these days. Like, he comes up over and over and over again as the person. The Shining is frequently referred to as a inspiration. I think it follows. The director said something about that. The Witch was for sure referenced, and in Stranger Things, although they sort of nod a little more towards like Stephen King's Shining rather than Kubrick's Shining. So there are inconsistencies in The Shining that are interesting, like the room to nowhere, or the office that's in the middle of the hotel that it looks out. And so there's that whole movie, Room 237, which bends over backwards to explain these inconsistencies, like the disappearing chair. And so the idea is, like, if a control freak like Stanley Kubrick was at the helm, those things were either purposeful or unimaginably accidental. Like, you can't even imagine it was the accident. So I wonder if those inconsistencies in this film are decisions that he just makes, because who cares? I think the two things that the monster, I call it a monster just because I guess that's the word for it, right? Yeah. That it does that are really inconsistent is one moment is just standing on the roof of a house.
Yeah.
Like, why would it have gone up there? If it's the whole thing is to walk towards you and eventually break you in half, how did it get there? Does it teleport now? I mean, did it climb up there? That's kind of weird. And in the swimming pool scene, when her friend shoots it in the head for the second time while it's underwater, it just appears to just bleed out underwater for a short time, and you don't see it for a while. Inconsistent again. To what purpose?
I can read that as being there was a curveball thrown. That's a bad metaphor. We had not seen what happens when it gets shot in the head, so. But
don't you, though, on the coast? I
thought he got shot in the arm in the coast.
I feel like it might have been in the head.
Really?
Yeah.
But the okay, well.
Yeah.
Write to us at scarythoughts.org.
Yeah, what do you think? Are you a arm? Like, where do you fall in this conspiracy? But because it happens so fast, and
true.
You can't really...
But the standing on the roof is another sort of e-reader moment where, like, I guess it can do whatever the hell it wants, right. But it's suddenly being incredibly inefficient. I feel like even though I don't need this monster to follow some sort of rules that I can follow, it is actually scarier if it just, like, one purpose. Right? It just comes at you at one speed, and it can look like anything.
Which is the Terminator 2, right? Like, that's the
we're, like, in your zone now.
Yeah, totally. So, like, I definitely did write a thesis paper in college about the Terminator film franchise, but I'm going to leave that flat here. But the idea that something is persistent, relentless, and unexpected. Again, just like life, like just like death. Like, it's coming. What's it going to look like?
Right.
So,
which maybe can lead to a conversation about millennials. I feel like there's been a lot of attention about how this film is about being a millennial. And I think, like how we were talking about what the word hipster means last episode, and how it's a really unsatisfactory generic term that loses its meaning quickly when you start to analyze or apply it to anything real. I think that talking about millennials is really, really pointless after a certain degree. But I do think that there is a way that it can be useful to think about this film about a certain generation and how we view them as stuck and inheriting the baggage of previous generations that in this film we don't see. And that's partly why they're just so emotionally washed out, and this horror that's coming at them that they can do nothing about and that they cannot vanquish, I think is connected to that sort of being in the world.
Yeah, I mean, think about how the monster often presents itself as an older person. Like when you do see adults, it's usually a manifestation from the creature. It's an old lady with a catheter. It's an older woman who may or may not be a prostitute, or it's the father. Like those are the only adult interactions that anybody really has in the movie, and they're monstrous, right? And it's so disconnected. It's to a certain point where you're like, okay, you can't trust anybody over 30 because every time somebody's over 30, they're walking slowly towards you, trying to kill you. That one way to look at it. The thing about, I think I always bristle about millennial hatred, or like people like even like saying millennial, is it's really, you have your ideas about what it's like to be young now, and you're old now, and you don't really have an idea what it's like to be young now. In the same way that no one had an idea what it was like to be you and young in the 90s, or I mean, because we're both in our, the age that we are, whatever.
Keep it vague.
Yeah, we'll keep it vague, but. Like that idea that what does an older person have to say to a younger generation? Like really, ultimately, it's just like the characters in the show. They're living amongst the wreckage of previous decades, like old TV shows, old cars, old clothes, an old stupid pool that she floats around in. And then to a certain point, as the film goes on, they get to older houses. Like they leave from their suburbs that have a feel of decay. There's like a feel of staleness to the suburbs that they're in, and then they pass the 8 Mile line and enter actual decay.
Yeah. It's like everything in this movie, except for the e-reader and the mobile phone. Mm-hmm. And the e-reader, I will give it this. Everything else is inherited and fading or crumbling, because it runs from ruin porn at one extreme to these like once middle-class suburban houses, now lower middle class. There's nothing nice in this film except for the one car and maybe the idea of an e-reader or a mobile phone, which we connect with millennials and their identities. Everything else is pretty much like, quote, generic, washed out, uninteresting, blah, banal, like as ineffectual as they are disaffected as emotionless characters.
Yeah. It maybe, I think a lot of like, we're obviously attracting horror fans, but if you liked this movie, I would really recommend watching The Myth of the American Sleepover, which is the director's previous movie, because it basically takes place in the same setting. It's suburban Detroit, coming of age. It's basically high school kids on the last weekend before summer. And there are scenes where they are disappearing into the ruins of Detroit, and it has, it definitely has a little bit of like a Lost Boys kind of feel to it. I mean, like the movie Lost Boys, like the vampires in Lost Boys, they're sort of out of time. Like they have this like weird gypsy punk aesthetic that never really existed. And when you go into their lair, there's a giant Jim Morrison tapestry, and there's all this hotel paraphernalia laying around, and there's this special dreaminess to the ruins of the past, and it doesn't seem to make anybody want to advance forward in any sort of way. Like there's just enough. It's comfortable enough. Like there's a comfort in the decay, which is a little bit like what nostalgia is to me in general. Like even the nostalgia that this film relies on is that there's a comfort in that decaying thing, and there's a discomfort in advancing or making something new or fresh or interesting. Like these characters don't do anything really except for try to run from this horrible situation that they've had like thrust on them.
No, exactly. I think that in a way that this film's set and setting feels, I think, to someone like you and I, and so many articles I read, there's a genericness to it. But I think the genericness is really in quotes, because I think that this movie is very much about whiteness and about class. I think there's something interesting about the way it's so self-contained, and I think that contributes to the way it feels like a parable or a metaphor for things, because it just creates this self-contained little universe, which is really satisfying. But the reduced number of elements, I mean, one aspect that is unmistakable is that despite the class setting, the sort of like lower middle class state of these characters, is that they have no responsibilities. They have seemingly no social tensions. Like their boredom is almost, pardon the P word, but it's hard for me to not read their boredom as not an extension of their sort of like cultural privilege. And then the tension that exists in this film is, how do I put this? A lot of this film is about this 8 Mile line that we brought up earlier in Detroit,
Right.
which is, although it's a line that divides, a sort of like suburban middle classness from lower class, it's also an incredible racial divide that is not explored in this film. It doesn't have to, but I feel like it's incredibly present because it is discussed and referred to a little clumsily.
Yeah.
But talking about like the very beginning, like thinking about driving around with my friends up north. Up north is away from the black people. When they go try to find where Hugh's lair was, they're probably south of 8 Mile. And then the swimming pool is south of 8 Mile, where they're going to like break in.
Yeah.
And I think it's hard not to think about like, well, who are these people that they have no jobs, no responsibilities? She went to class, but that's sort of...
Yeah, she's in college, like, for sure.
Right, but these characters, we can think of them as like disengaged and disaffected, but at the same time, like, do they have a care in the world? I mean, it's a bummer that their father died when they were young and their mother's an alcoholic, but there just aren't social tensions in this film.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if the weird, like, clunky little monologue that her friend Yara gives about 8 Mile were absent from the film, I think it would be difficult to import any of that into this movie. I didn't pick up on any of that, other than like.
Oh, I don't think intentionally so.
Yeah.
I'm saying that it's there despite. I think that her saying that doesn't actually bring it up. I think it's a sort of generic way to talk about this like dividing line, and I'm saying, well, okay, what is that dividing line? It's not an abstraction. It's a very real social reality that so many Americans are living with, but these kids aren't.
Yeah, so I guess you were talking about like class, right? I think it's pretty clear that they're probably lower middle class.
Yeah.
And because they don't really have any resources to escape the creature, because that's what everybody says. Well, I would just fly to New York. Great. Okay, you just fly to New York. But they don't have that option because they don't have any money. In some ways, like their aimlessness, it reminds me a little bit of Gummo, where like nothing's really happening except for this external like threat. Because, I mean, God, Myth of American Sleepover is so similar to Dazed and Confused, where like nothing's happening and the focus is on what all these kids do just without external incident. Like what is the natural move for these kids? And it seems to be just lay around, have some cheap beer, play Go Fish or whatever they're playing, quote Dostoevsky, who I can never pronounce because I just can't. Dostoevsky. Yeah, I'm from the South, so I'll horribly mispronounce pretty much anything that's not Southern. But yeah, these kids, I don't know, they're just like generic kids to me. And then there you go. There's, I'm white, so they're generic to me.
Yep.
Right?
Totally.
I wonder if the director added in the 8 Mile stuff and any sort of like external real world response to using Detroit. Because the first movie was definitely, the fact that it took place in Detroit was kind of like a thing about it. And if he didn't mention it, you wouldn't know where that movie took place in. I don't think. I don't think you would know where It Follows took, because you don't know when it takes place. So why wouldn't you not know where it takes place too? It's weird that it rooted it. Like it's like a really strong decision to root the film in an actual place. So, which is weird to me based on how dreamy the rest of the movie is.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like the mobile phone. It's like the e-reader. It's another sort of grounding moment that takes you out of the dream space of the film.
So what did you think about the main actress, Maika Monroe?
As an actress?
Yeah, her in the film. And
I thought she was great. I thought upon rewatching it, I ended up watching it a bunch of times. She definitely held my interest, and I thought, the performances were generally, well, they were very unique. Like the sort of deadpanness of all the dialogue, in some ways, I think is much to its credit. I think it was a really interesting, unique choice to have a bunch of actors in a horror film just seem like so bored and so uninvested in anything that was happening. At the same time, sometimes it made some of the scenes just feel like bad acting. And some of the scenes, I was just like, wait, is this really cunningly constructed? Or is this just a bad take and they just had to move on?
Yeah, I think I'm going to be pretty generous with it. Like, I really liked her, and I think that A lot of these new directors seem to have like these muse actresses that are really embody the role and make the role bigger than they could have ever even imagined it being. Another thing that this movie reminds me of is that kind of like Tumblr rap scene, like Kitty Pryde, like she has her weird little dream sequence video, like one of her videos, I can't remember the name of it, but it really reminds me of It Follows, because people are just sitting around drinking beers, kind of in bedrooms. There's Christmas lights in the background. It's about a boy, but sort of not. And there's this pace and this tone that I think might just be really current, and I'm just not picking it up because of my generation. Like I could be totally missing it. But I also love all these new horror actresses. Like I love these like quirky, odd, Close Savini-esque actresses. Because in the old days in horror movies, it would be just like, strippers with aspirations on the screen, which I'd never really connected to because that wasn't the kind of dude I was growing up. Where these kids seem more reflective of the type of person I was growing up, or probably would be now if I was that age now.
Well, I think there was a style choice also that you alluded to, someone pointing out on a podcast. What was it? The podcast you introduced.
Is it Double Toasted?
Yeah. What were you saying that they said about?
Oh, they said it was a straight up mumblecore movie, which I hadn't even thought about, because that sort of terminology for music, it's just generationally, it's not me, right? Like that extreme taxonomy. I mean, it sort of happens in metal, right? Like, is it thrash metal or is it death metal? And that sort of thing never interested
different.
me at all. But now those taxonomies seem really important because there's not a record store anymore. You're not going to a thing and going, okay, rock, and you're just flipping through it and whatever somebody has happened to put it in there. Often, you're at the mercy of algorithms when you're discovering new music. Like I'm recently new to Spotify, like 2 weeks ago, and I'm totally blown away. I'm sure it's probably evil on the back end and no one's getting paid, but for a user, it's great. And I think that those terms like mumblecore and things like that might be more useful for people to kind of describe the things that they like. Because now you type in music and like all these similar artists come up, and I'm amazed at how good these computer programs are at recommending music to me. Like I find they're almost more accurate than my friends these days. So if there is to be a hero in this film, I think it's one of two neighbors, right? Like the people who make the most heroic moves are the dudes who are willing to sleep with Jay, which is hilarious. It's like, the one neighbor who's already slept with her, he seems to not really believe it. He just thinks like, yeah, she's crazy. He probably had some awesome crazy sex with her in the past, and he's just willing to like step up and kind of like be the hero. He goes to gets the car. He drives them around. He gets the gun. Initially, he introduces that into the film. So he, I think, I don't know. It's a weird. He's a heroic character. But then there's her friend Jay, who is her friend, who that was his first kiss, and he's like Paul. Yeah, Paul. Like, Paul is like deep in the friend zone and is never going to come out, except for the potential of this like supernatural event that has released him from the friend zone. So he's theoretically happy for a time until the thing comes after him. But there's one way of
he's not only released from the friend zone, they are a full-on couple. Like they are walking down the street in matching clothes.
Holding hands,
and they're both infected, so when we see someone following them at the end that may or may not be it is coming for one of them, and ostensibly both of them.
Well, him first anyway.
Right.
Like, and they're so close that it's weird too to think about, like, what if you passed the creature on to not a stranger, but somebody you actually cared about? Like that, how does that change the dynamic of running from the thing? Can you pass it back to the other person and have them make a run for it? I mean, who knows?
And the passing it around, it definitely asks a certain ethical question, I think, because what was done to Jay is unconscionable, right? Right? Committing someone to being on the run at some degree for the rest of their life is unconscionable. At the same time, so what do? Let yourself get killed? Well, then it gets brought back to the last person, which, well, it was their fault that you got here in the first place, but it seems to be an ethical dilemma in both directions. You are either actively infecting someone or passively letting it fall back to the previous person, but you're dead.
Right.
So it's not entirely like murdering someone by sleeping with them and passing it on. It's sort of like, well, it's murder in both directions.
Right. I mean, I was thinking like the gangster move is just like if you were done running from the thing and you were mad at the person who gave it to you. If it was me, I'm for sure handcuffing myself to that person when I see them. like you're going with me.
Oh, I didn't think of that. That's really good.
Yeah.
But thinking about the two hero non-heroes, one thing I will give this movie in terms of like symbolic gestures that I thought were pretty clever. I did think that it was pretty interesting that Greg has sex with her, and then is killed by his half-naked mother, who then fucks him to death.
Right.
And then Paul vanquishes, to some degree, it in the embodiment of her father, while the father is like hurling domesticated objects at her.
Yeah.
I would never sort of lay any sort of like Oedipal narrative on that by any means, but I think there was a really interesting way of playing with the idea of parents. The role that parents have in this film is kind of interesting and brings a really interesting layer to the film, but those two facts sort of like add up to something really compelling about how terrifying parents are in this world, or how terrified maybe these characters are of their own family baggage or something.
Yeah, it seems like the characters are also really into like kind of retreating into an even younger time. Like, you know, Hugh, when they're standing in line at the movie theater and they're playing that game, like, who's a person you would want to trade places with? Which is interesting because when you pass on the demon, you're like trading places. That curse is trading places. So they're having this conversation about like who they would want to become. And the character Hugh, he's like, that little kid over there, that's what I want to be. Yeah. Like, before anything kicks off, before there's any sort of damage or anything like that happening. And it's just really oddly regressive. Like, it's like, man, you suck. Like, why would you want to be a little kid? Really? You want to go watch some cartoons too? Have some breakfast cereal? I mean, get a fucking blanket for yourself?
Well, another way in which that happens in the film is that the first thing Jay does when she flees is gets on a little girl's bicycle and goes to the playground and gets on a swing.
Yeah.
Right.
And I just find that sort of, you know, regressive adult childhood, adult coloring book, safe space thing, it's not the answer to modern threats, you know? And I think that's a little bit going on in this movie is like, what do they know how to do? They retreat to childhood. They don't really have any great solutions. I mean, the guys from Double Toasted podcast, he had a really funny expression. He said, I'm going to go all Home Alone on this ghost's ass, which is what you would do. You would cover it in paint and be like, look at this motherfucker. It's chasing after me. Look, there it is. And you're like, oh my God, that's creepy. And then you would hopefully find some allies. You would be solution oriented, or like at least figure out how fast is it walking? Let's go find it and lay out like 100-meter yard in front of it and just time it and be like, okay, I have a baseline of how far it can go. Just any of these things that an action-oriented, solution-oriented person would do, totally absent here. I mean, so basically, Macaulay Culkin's character is more effective at dealing with threats than any of these characters. I mean,
speaking of which, and in the vein of methods of vanquishment, what did you think of the gun usage in this film?
Well, it's one of my favorite. That Smith & Wesson is one of my favorite revolvers of all time. So I was really happy to see it on the screen. But
used so effectively.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm kidding.
Well, good luck hitting something invisible, you know. Or I did like that the friend got shot. You know, because that seems like kind of something that would happen if you were just aimlessly like shooting at something.
Well, both times that he fires it, he's firing it actually at one of his friends primarily.
Right.
Like above, at the beach, she's like, what's her name, is like ducking the bullets.
Yeah.
And then at the pool above water and below water, he's always shooting just inches from one of his friends while he's trying to clip it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's not saying anything pro or negative.
Oh, I didn't mean that. I just meant, no. I just meant, what did you think?
Oh, you mean about the marksmanship? Would I rate their marksmanship? Not very well.
He's just like waving the gun around, shooting at his friends, and wins.
Yeah.
And gets the girl.
Yeah.
He just firing poorly until he kills the thing, and then he gets laid and he gets the girl at the end. It's so weird. It's so random.
Well, or it's also not either. You know, like he becomes an action hero. basically, one of the other things I really liked about this movie is how it adopts a lot of the imagery of this, or at least the cinematography of slasher movies. Like whenever you see the monster, it's standing as still as Jason does. But Jason is a menacing character that just walks towards you relentlessly. And same thing with Michael Myers. And I think the Halloween parallels
and early zombies,
earlier.
pre-Return of the Living Dead zombies.
Yeah,
they just keep coming.
Yeah. Well, are you a fast zombie or slow zombie kind of guy?
I don't give a shit.
Yeah, you don't care. Yeah.
It's just scary.
Yeah, I personally, to be on record here, is I think zombies should start off fast as they turn and slow down as they decompose.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's the most logical way of handling it.
So their speed and smell are correlated?
Yeah, like you would probably be able to look at a zombie and, like, based on its state of decomposition, know how fast you needed to move.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But even then, even those rules are in flux. I mean, the first time somebody said, hey, the zombie's moving fast, I think it was like 28 days later, blew people's minds. It's all anybody...
That was Return of the Living Dead, but that was a pretty small film. Yeah.
Oh, with the punks in the graveyard?
Yeah. They ran.
Yeah.
They sprinted. And then it got amped up to, the swarm.
Yeah.
Of that awful...
That might be
World
the
War
worst
Z.
Zombie movie. I know it's...
World War Z?
No, not World War Z. Return of the Living Dead. I think it's...
What?
I watched it again pretty recently.
I watch it all the time. I was there at noon. It's opening day in the theater. Enough about Return of the Living Dead. Let's get back to...
Yeah. Okay.
What about the soundtrack?
Another soundtrack that I liked, the guy recorded it under the name Disasterpiece, which I think is pretty interesting that you're seeing not just the name of the composer, you're seeing the name of the composer's band pop up in movies. Like, for instance, Clint Mansell, right? He pops up as a score composer under his own name, but I think he has his own band, right? So this dude records as Disasterpiece. It's almost a Dead kind of thing, right? Yeah. Like it's the personality of the tone of that stuff. And I often wonder, will we see it even further? Will you see, smaller outfits? Stranger Things, it has Survive. It's not whatever the guy's name is in Survive doing the soundtrack. It's actually the band did the soundtrack. And I think that, I don't really know what it means, but it's interesting that it makes it almost a consumable download. I went on Spotify and listened to it and enjoyed listening to it on its own. I don't know that that's unique, but
it's fairly unique. There are examples like Daft Punk doing Irreversible, or
right.
Junkie XL doing, was it Fury Road? Oh, God. Anyway, bands are creeping into soundtracking, I feel like, more and more. But it seems more common in smaller independent films.
And, the other two things, really only two things I can even pull out of just researching him, I didn't go too deep, is he's a video game soundtrack designer, and he talked about the difference between building tension in video games versus building tension in a movie, and how much easier he thought the movie was to build tension in than video games, which that's a real difference between consuming horror now, is that now there's horror video games where you're actually part of the thing, and so instead of going, oh, don't go in there, you just don't go in there. And you just go into another room and do whatever it is. And so, you're not just aware of, rules of horror, you're also aware of maybe rules of horror in horror video games or other franchises. And so when you start to see creators moving between not just genre, but media, it's, maybe there's something interesting to say about that cross-pollination.
Yeah. I do feel that the soundtrack usage in this film was super, super effective. It really did add to, aside from the main theme, actually being catchy and a good piece, a memorable piece of film music, which is, I think, an increasingly rare phenomenon in film, having soundtrack music that is actually memorable.
Right.
In addition to that, I think that it's how scary it genuinely was has so much to do with the effectiveness of the music, even though the stingers, they're just stingers. Stingers are generally pretty much, at this point, a high-pitched, piercing, violin-ish sound. but sometimes it works better than others. Sometimes it's totally in sync with the picture.
Yeah, I think that the soundtrack really drives the scary moments in this film. It really signals when weird things are about to happen. And, you know, I love that weird, like, sawtooth wave, like whenever something's happening, it just has this, like, it triggers some sort of, like, Rain Man alarm thing in me. And I'm like, oh, I'm supposed to be freaked out right now.
And I feel like this film has two modes. It was either blasé, sort of virgin suicides, washed out, calm, disengaged, and dread. And the soundtrack definitely followed those two.
Yeah. You know, you bring up Virgin Suicides, and, you know, Air did the soundtrack to that. And
oh, right.
You think about, like, the whole time that soundtrack is going on. Like, when I hear that soundtrack, I can think about scenes from the movie. But I can't even imagine what the soundtrack is like when nothing scary is happening in this movie, or if there is even music happening. Right now, I'm at a loss of what it looks like when they're sitting around in her room talking about whether or not they're going to sleep together. Like, what is that? I can't even remember the music. But I have a really strong memory of every time something scary happens.
Right.
I'm like, oh, like if you played it right now, I'd be like, oh, that was that scene where that happened. So, right. I don't know.
There are some, actually another example is Broadcast, having done the soundtrack to Barbarian Sound Studio before she passed away, is another horror soundtrack that I feel like stands on its own. One of my favorite horror film soundtrack composers is Joseph Bishara, and although he has done a lot of movies that I don't particularly care for, I actually listen to those soundtracks, and it's really just sort of like tension stinger, atonal droning. There's a certain genericness to it, but at the same time, it's done incredibly effectively. Like, I feel like he's about as good as horror film soundtracks get. Look him up.
Yeah. And I think for somebody who's a non-musician, just even the idea of scoring a movie seems so mysterious to me. Like, do you get like like when you sit down to score it, are you already working on music before it's even shot, or or do you just like play the music, the movie without sound and just noodle around until you find some stuff?
It can happen anyway, and especially at lower budget films, because they're not part of this machinery that has all those kinds of questions already mapped out. There's actually a really good video done by the YouTube channel Every Frame a Painting, where he talks about why Marvel film music is so generic and so unremarkable despite the success. And it is blamed on when editors are building their films, they use already existing music to edit to, and then composers have to come in and replace the music that they were using to edit to with new music, but the filmmaker, the director, is so locked into the temp music that they were using that then the composer ends up having to just remake the temp music without crossing copyright boundaries. So everybody's just sort of like recycling the same three ideas for any different kind of emotional tone, to where everybody's just making the same music over and over because they're just using each other's music to temporarily replace. It's like an idea just keeps getting passed back and forth, and it keeps getting watered down every time.
Oh, interesting. I love that YouTube channel, Every Frame a Picture.
It's great.
I think they do a really good job of just thinking about a lot of the craft of film, too, which is pretty interesting. Okay, so the film ends kind of ambiguously, which, I think for a self-contained film is really interesting, but it's a classic horror trope. It's ambiguous so that in the next movie, it just sets up for a sequel. A lot of these small horror movies don't seem to be generating that many sequels. I mean, you're not going to see The Witch 2, but conversely, we are going to see Stranger Things Season 2. There was The Conjuring 2. And it's interesting that these crews are trying to capture lightning in the bottle twice. And I wonder if any of them are going to be successful. I mean, how did they even kick off? Like, is it like Phantasm 1 and 2, where it's like literally the movie starts the moment that the last film ended? I mean, that's kind of interesting. Like, so would an interesting way for this film to continue be they turn around and the guy's following him, and then it opens like that, or does some time pass, or
they've broken up, or they go have a three-way with someone they hate, or
yeah, or I was laughing at somebody the other day. I was like, what if you just went and fucked a dolphin and it swam away? Like does it cross species?
Wow,
boundaries?
you just totally ruined the movie for me.
Yeah, I mean, like and then at that point, like, is another dolphin chasing the dolphin that you just had sex with?
Wow,
I don't know. Yeah,
that's a really important question.
Yeah, because who knows? I mean, maybe that's an option, or not.
I think you've just negated the possibility of my having anything more to say about this movie.
Well, interspecies paranormal activity that's driven by sexual activity often does have that effect.
Often. Should we end it there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say about It Follows. I enjoyed the movie. I look forward to seeing more of these types of movies. I think we're going to see a point where we're just like, oh my God, another American Apparel actress with a John Carpenter soundtrack. Fuck this. But until that moment, I'm happy to see this stuff happen because I like it. I really like it.
I agree. All I know is that, like, I thought it was super scary, and then I watched it more and I got more out of it. And that's kind of all I ask of a horror movie, is that it be somehow scary, not too cheesy, have things that open up upon repeat watchings.
Yeah. Or in the very least, have a fun conversation about at another time, with people. Like, people have been really interested in having conversations about horror movies. And since we've been doing this podcast, people I know I've been doing it. And I'm surprised at how many people really want to talk about horror movies.
It's true.
I mean, it's really surprised me that people want to have these conversations about what they would have done, or what they liked about it, or what it reminds them of, and then how almost mainstream horror is for some people. Like the lady that was cleaning my teeth the other day, we were talking about like Stranger Things, and she's not like a genre fan. She's not like some weirdo that obsesses over dark music and makes odd fashion choices. She's just like a normal person and has like this really deep understanding of the genre. And it makes me wonder if this was kind of like what like Shakespearean drama was in the 1600s. Like everybody kind of saw it. It was populist. People were into it, and you knew the beats and you knew the moves. And in some cases, the same actors moved back and forth between similar or different roles, depending on who was around. Maybe horror is the definitive genre of our time because it's so populist.
Well, in that light, perhaps I can give Stranger Things a little more credit than I might have given it previously, because it can serve not as a gateway. I don't care if people watch horror films. It doesn't matter. But as an education on what is possible within horror films and what the history is and what the legacy is. And I think that's a positive thing, is when work can open up other work for people. That when art can serve as a gateway to its own field.
Yeah, especially when there's a chain of influence. I think about, one of my favorite bands of all time is the Misfits. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't introduced to the Misfits by friends. I was introduced to the Misfits by Metallica's Garage Days album. Same thing with the Sex Pistols. None of my friends were punk rockers. None of them knew anything. But I really liked Anarchy in the USA on this Megadeth album. It was a cover, and you open up the liner notes, and there's an entire world of new, more obscure, interesting things to obsess about and to a certain degree differentiate yourself with. Yeah, it's cool to see all this stuff, to have such access to it and have so much of it made. I mean, I think a lot of people, I hear people of my generation, kind of like a Gen X generation, sort of like hate on the accessibility of all this stuff. Like that was somehow special. Because I remember there was a time when you wanted to see an obscure horror movie, you would probably have to go to either a midnight showing someplace if you had a cool movie theater around, or go sit in a hotel room at a sci-fi convention or something like that and just look at somebody's weird movies that they were. And that was always super weird because you're in a dark room with a bunch of strangers, mostly perverts, watching these obscure movies. And that's, anybody can watch this stuff now. And I think it's making it better, that there's so much of it. And that's probably the opposite to how I would have thought when I was 18. I would have hated that this stuff was so accessible because it was so much part of my identity. And now, I think everybody should be into it.
All right. With that, let's fade to black and roll the credits.
All right. Don't forget, rate us on iTunes and Stitcher.
If you haven't already while you were listening to this episode.
If you have a friend with a phone, grab their phone and rate. You probably want to say a lot about this episode. Just get your friend's phone and have them rate it for you.
And join us next episode when we're going to be talking about The Neon Demon. Come prepared. Watch it. It's great. I'm Mark Kate.
And I'm Chad Lott.
Thanks for listening.